All right, so this is an interesting example of how we can use values to our advantage to really emphasize something as simple as a character-driven like illustration. I think your illustration right now is at a very good place. It's very interesting with the flow of the character that you're already creating. The main thing that's right now holding it back is going to be the way you've chosen to arrange your values. So right now you can see we have a light value of our or like a midtone value of our character in front of basically the same value or pretty close to, at least in the background. And if we think about how we can create focus in a scene, well, we can create focus using contrast. So contrast between light and dark, for example, is the biggest like example of that. And right now the contrast isn't really very present. The areas where we have the most contrast are actually more so down low with the robes and the background right over there. But obviously that's not necessarily a focal point. So what we want to do, we want to essentially focus on almost looking at this from a more abstract point of view. So let's say my light's going to be coming in from up high to the left. So we can quite easily visually represent that by just doing something like this. Obviously it's not entirely accurately lit, but we'll make do for now. And you can do the same thing perhaps with the light coming in from the left hand side, light coming in from the right hand side, perhaps even light coming in from the bottom more so, which would give us a couple of few examples of how we can arrange values in like a character-driven portrait. Now, if I have my light coming in from above, then it would make sense essentially to make sure that I can accentuate those shapes that I've just created, those light shapes, by now adding new shapes in the background that overlap with that and contrast that value that we've just laid out. So that means something like a dark value behind there could actually work quite nicely to help emphasize this focal point in particular, because we want to have a lot of contrast around our focal point, which is usually the face in a character-driven illustration. Now, if I want to even get an even more readable painting going, like I can do the same thing by adding like a light shape down low over here, which brings more attention to the torso. So that would mean that my entire character essentially is readable, but we don't always want that, so you can actually just get rid of that and get away with something like this. But sometimes it might be fun to make sure that you're almost like creating a little bit of a chessboard sort of situation where we are trying to emphasize like a few lines, like the red lines that I have right now. Those are the areas that are the most visible, that have the most contrast, and I'll indicate the edges that we are sorta losing somewhat, but also these edges are much less important. It's the red edges that we need. The blue edges are optional essentially. So if we would do that for the other examples that we have, so we can bring it over here, for example. Once again, I can start thinking about how I can arrange these values, and maybe in this case I'll have like a shape, dark shape behind the character right over there. And that dark shape could be anything. It could be a cloud, it could be a car, it could be a tree, it could be whatever it is that you would have seen that would seem fitting for the subject of your painting, right? And once again, we can do the same thing perhaps with a light shape, kind of making sure that we're arranging some light shapes behind there as well. And this is basically purely abstract shape design that we're now trying to use to our advantage to get like nice and appealing compositions going. So let's say we would want to use something like trees to our advantage, for example. Well, maybe we'll have like a few branches splitting off. We don't necessarily want to have like it'd be too obvious as well what we're doing. So maybe we'll just sort of overlap it partially right over there. And then we'll do like a few more. And you can see how sort of creating a forest and very carefully placing elements in this forest so that we can bring more attention to certain parts of our painting really help with creating that clear focus, especially if we then can sort of almost, whoops, didn't mean to do that. Let's get that back into place. There we go. So especially if we can then sort of vignette the forest as well to kind of once again bring more focus to the character itself right now. So this works quite nicely. Same thing with the values that we can arrange over here. So maybe something like getting a dark shape right over there, could be bushes, for example. Any amorphous object, like foliage, clouds, is always a good opportunity to sort of use that to our advantage to arrange these values in any way that we see fit, any way that would benefit our composition. And you can even go as far as to start layering them on top, essentially, to add like a little bit of extra depth to the scene. Once again, play around with the background, which could be trees essentially. And then if you want to emphasize the head, maybe there's going to be some light coming in between the trees right over there. And once again, we've arranged our composition in a way where we can create a very clear focal point. So final example, it's the same as the one we have above. We can just sort of need to flip the value scheme. So once again, coming up with something that would mainly highlight the right-hand side. But once again, not all edges need to be visible. We can actually do this in a pretty abstract way. So something like that, even if it doesn't have any meaning really, should already do the trick. Now, how do we apply this to your own composition? So we'll be focusing on the bottom one right now. The main thing that I immediately would want to do is I want to get your character, and I'm going to do a very quick sloppy lasso tool job for the moment, but it'll get the point across hopefully. So we'll get the entire character, and the advantage is you already have a direct light source in the scene essentially, because you're working with the magic sphere, the magic ball that you have floating right there, which seems to be emanating some kind of light. So that's definitely something we can use to our advantage to get like one of these more graphic compositions going as well. So we'll start with that. There we go. Let's separate her from her background a little bit. And now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just darken the entire character. Why? Because I want her to be quite dark in front of the bright background. Now what this also does for us, it basically makes sure that we are now able to add in these more bright highlights in areas where they would once again help emphasizing the composition. So the sphere is sort of slightly in front, but mostly to the side. So we can introduce almost like a rim light, but it's a little bit more than a rim light. It's actually bleeding into the scene a little bit. And I'm not going to do this very cleanly. I'm going to do this in a bit more of a quick, rough way, because I essentially just want to make sure that I have those values once again in an area where we could bring a little bit more focus on specific parts of our composition. So something like that. Don't want to overdo it either. Maybe like the light will be able to hit like part of the hood right there. You can just sort of think about which shapes essentially the light would be creating, which shapes the light would be able to reach, where it wouldn't be able to reach. Which helps us create like quite a nice dynamic looking painting. And since, you know, we're gonna have some light fall off, doesn't have to be quite as bright on all parts of the illustration. But essentially, once again, you can sort of get the light to hit the left side of the character. And then we can also play around with how we can actually look to change perhaps the value of the background to help with that overall readability. So perhaps we want a little bit more contrast behind over here. And luckily, since it's seems to be sort of a mysterious forest, we can work a lot with atmospheric elements like maybe fog clouds rolling in, etc., to help with overall readability of the painting as well. Let's see if we can actually make these shapes a little bit more crisp here and there. There we go, that should help. And this is the foundation of any sort of character-driven composition that I would create myself, right? So I would always try to bring out these light and dark shapes and use them to our advantage. Now, I also think in this case, we don't really get much benefit from being as removed from the composition as we are right now. So just grabbing all of that and essentially zooming in a little bit more on what's happening. We don't necessarily need to see that much of the character. Something like that should do the trick. So let's see if we can actually just kind of bring some magical elements into the mix, maybe give it a little bit of energy as well. Got like a little bit of a glow going. And then once again, manipulate the background so we can use things to our advantage. So maybe we have like the tree canopy all the way up here, creating like a nice dark shape. And we can then use the shapes of the tree still to get that focal point, to get that flow in there. What you were doing with the placement of the trees, I think, was working pretty well. Once again, bushes are a good opportunity to get some nice graphic shapes in as well. And we can create like a nice vignette that helps with the flow of the scene as well, right? Maybe like some light in between some of the trees. And that's the essence, I think, of what I would be changing in this composition myself. So once again, obviously this is a quick paint over. I'm not going to be doing it any form of justice in the amount of time I'm spending on this. But hopefully it gives you a good foundation to work with in how to continue a painting like this, right? Maybe we can even have some of the bushes sort of overlap there. So there we go. Hope that makes sense. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the Discord, and I'll see you again next time. Take care.